I drink your milkshake.
The Eurodollar was selected by the market. Nobody made the international community use dollars amongst themselves back in the 50s and 60s. Where it really started was kind of a combination of, after World War II, the Soviet Union was holding dollar balances for business in Europe, but they didn't want to hold it in American banks because we were entering the Cold War. So they started holding US dollar balances in European banks, and that's where the name Eurodollar comes from. But nobody made the Soviet Union do that. And from there, it just kind of branched out. And now we have this huge spider web of Eurodollar transactions and Eurodollar payment systems and all this stuff that goes all over the world. And the Fed does not regulate it. They can influence it, but they don't regulate it. There's not a central channel that it flows through. And so I just kind of, to have a little fun, tweeted out that, the Eurodollar market, it's not state sponsored. The free market chose it, and it's decentralized. And I said something to the effect that Bitcoin maxis should love this. Well, they didn't love it, John.
I also think it's ironic, too, because those who are the complete opposite of a dollar maxi, everyone who continually calls for the end of the U.S. dollar, I think misinterprets your stance with the dollar milkshake theory. And it's not like you're this, being a U.S. apologetic, or at the end think that the current system is fair. It's just understand the mechanisms at play and don't get your feelings too worked up and miss basically how this can ultimately play out. Now, with that in mind, we had this article or this soundbite, literally a quote, like things are changing for the first time in 100 years, or whatever the soundbite was between Xi and Putin. And I think everyone just was so happy to grasp onto that. Like, this is the beginning of the end. And sure, maybe there is something afoot, but maybe it takes another 100 years. We really don't know. So with that also being said, it's ironic to me that the Eurodollar market would have actually been born in Russia, of all places, considering the hype around this China and Russia conversation. But before we get too far, we want to keep this midweek episode kind of focused, but I do think, if you could, let's take a step back and maybe just give some clarity on what the Eurodollar market actually is, and partly in terms of like Jeff Snyder's work, like what is Eurodollar market? Why does it create such a huge systemic issue that's ultimately dollar bullish in the near term?
So ultimately what it is the terminology makes it very confusing. Even when I first heard it, I just assumed they were talking about euros. It was some slang term for euros, but it's not euros. It's essentially any dollar that exists outside the continental borders of the domestic United States is essentially a Eurodollar. And there are huge US dollar balances all over the world: Asia, South America, Africa, Europe, all over the place. And the reason is because the US dollar has become the global reserve currency, most people, most businesses, most financial services firms, in one way or the other, need dollars or save in dollars. And so it's kind of like it's become the common language amongst commerce throughout the world. If somebody from Brazil flies to Kenya and they're going to do business, if they don't speak the other person's language, but they're in business, they probably each speak English. So English becomes the common language in which they do business. Now, it's not always the case, but it's often the case. English is the most common language used in global commerce, and dollars is the most common currency used in global commerce. And so when commerce takes place outside the United States and it's denominated in dollars, that's a Eurodollar. That's a Eurodollar transaction. Eurodollar credit has been extended. The reason it's important to understand is because, I don't have time to get into this right now. At some point, we'll do this whole episode on this. But based on the design of the system, one of two things has to happen. Either the money has to be circulating at a rate fast enough to service all the debts and to make everybody whole on the transactions and the debts that are owed within the system. If that doesn't happen, then the central bank, in this case the Fed, has to come in and inject new collateral into the system. The problem is in the Eurodollar market, the The Fed doesn't have jurisdiction outside the United States. And there's no entity outside the United States that can inject new dollars, new collateral, base money into the system. And so it's very important that the Eurodollar system functions as far as the circulation. There is no reverse gear. That's the problem. Based on the design of the system, it must grow. It's like a shark swimming through the water. If the shark stops swimming, he sinks and he dies and he can't breathe. Same with the Eurodollar system. Or just really the whole monetary system. If currency is not circulating, the system seizes up and it dies. And so that's why it's important, because there is no entity outside the United States that can inject new base money or new collateral into the system. It ultimately comes back onto the Fed. But it's ultimately also why the outside, why the periphery, why the Eurodollar market collapses before the core, which is the United States.
Awesome. That was, I know for a very complex topic, to do a flyby is not easy. I might add a little something to that too, as I conceptualize it in my head during this conversation. It's almost impossible for a bank to survive a bank run. You know, based on how fractional reserve banking is, they're able to extend credit, let's say 10 to 1, right? So every dollar of deposits, they can create 10. So it's the commercial banks that truly print money. We're not going to get into why real QE isn't money printing, and it ultimately needs to be facilitated through commercial banks. But that's the concept. They have the ability to lend and extend credit and therefore expand the monetary base. So if you have a marketplace, any monetary authority or any type of monetary system that's acting outside of the United States, they're still under the same fractional reserve rules. It's as you're saying, without endless credit growth, the system eventually collapses. Now, in the United States, when you have a bank run or you have a systemic issue, the Fed can come in with additional liquidity to plug the hole. And this is something that we've talked about before and we'll continue to talk about. Is first, before you get worked up about central bank responses, make sure you understand the size of the hole. And in this case, what we're dealing with right now, the hole is probably a lot bigger than people realize, partly because of this Eurodollar market environment. But now if you're outside of the purview of the Federal Reserve and you have banks and banking systems in the Eurodollar market or anywhere outside of the U.S. periphery, now they've extended credit in a denomination that they can't actually provide liquidity for if there's a crisis. So you end up having this bank run, so to speak, in a much more rapid pace, especially when you consider a lot of these entities were, when the dollar was at its weakest the last, say, decade, that they were borrowing in dollars. And now that there's been this big switch and the dollar is much stronger, those dollar-denominated loans are now much larger, much more expensive because of the fact that they're generating GDP and revenue as a nation in their own currency. So that hole is now actually getting bigger because as the economy contracts, they're also now struggling to fill that hole because the same amount of effort provides less of a result. And so that's where you kind of get this spiraling effect. And as you've said, and one of the things that always stood out to me with the dollar milkshake theory that I think people lose sight of is your argument always is that hyperinflation or the dollar weakening at a rapid pace is not what kills the dollar and breaks the system. It's the endless and out of control strengthening of the dollar.
That's right. That's right. And because all systems are the same, you know, the monetary systems in each country around the world are the same. They're built upon the same concepts. But when those countries print, they're printing for their domestic economies. When the United States prints, they are printing for the whole world because the whole world uses dollars and uses dollar-based credit. And you're not going to have a situation where the core goes into hyperinflation before the periphery because there's just more demand for the core. Now, that doesn't mean the dollar can't go down. You know, and it's very possible the dollar goes down over the next couple of years. You know, I don't know for sure. What that would do is that would extend the game. That would mean that we're not going to have this big end game in the next year or two because the dollar going down allows the system to continue functioning. You know, it's, again, as you pointed out, as the dollar rising is what causes the dollar rising is what causes the system to seize up.